Let's talk a little bit about creating values using watercolor. So for this next stage of your project, you're going to need to create some different value tones of paper. So what you'll need, if you've read the directions already, is a light value, a medium value, and a dark value. But how do you create those? Watercolor isn't similar to others in that some sets will come with a white at times, and we know white will help make colors lighter. But most of our sets don't have white, and in fact a lot of people don't like to use white watercolor when they mix it together. So when it comes to making a light value, the white paper is actually going to act like your white paint. And how we can create light values is by making sure that we don't have as much pigment in our water mixture. So to demonstrate, I'm going to take one of my colors and I'm going to pick up some of that watercolor. And I want to make sure I have a lot of water in with that color. So when I first put it on here, I could still see the paper through here, but it's still kind of dark. It's not very light. It's not a light pink. If I just dip my paintbrush into water again without dipping into paint, see how I can get a much lighter value? So if I have less pigment on my paintbrush and more water, I can get some very light values of paint. So that is one way we can control light values in watercolor. And for our purposes, this is probably the best way. This is just a very thin wash. Some may even call it a glaze of color. So you may want to have an extra sheet of paper near you when you're trying to create some light values, just because it is a little hard to judge at times how much pigment you have on your paintbrush when you dip it into your watercolor set. So if you test it out first on an extra sheet of paper, then you'll know if you need to dip your brush into more water to thin out that pigment, or if you may even need to bring more pigment into your paintbrush by mixing it around in the paint. So that is one way and our best way to create light mediums, because as I said, most of our sets are not going to have white watercolor in them. So these are light values. And if this is what light values look like, then this would be more of your medium value. So a medium value is going to be your standard wash. You have a nice amount of pigment in your paintbrush mixed with the water. It's not so thick that we can't see the transparency and the paper shining through, but it's not so light that it just looks like colored water. So dark mediums, dark values is one where you can have a little bit more fun in color mixing. So of course you can create a darker medium by just making sure you pick up a lot more pigment into your mixture. Again, though, you got to balance it. You don't want this to look like tempera paint or acrylic paint. We still want the white of our paper to shine through, but a little bit of a heavier mixture compared to a regular standard wash will definitely read as a darker value. You can also create darker values by layering, and layering works best when one color has dried and then you add another layer of that color on top. But there's other ways we can create some dark values. So that's what we're going to experiment here with, is some dark values. So using red as my example again, I can go with the standard, and I'm going to use a plate here for mixing. And even though our watercolor sets like these come with a lid that most people use for mixing paint, I like to mix it on something like a old plastic lid from maybe a butter container or a takeout container, or I will get, obviously, a styrofoam plate at times to use as my palette. It's easy to clean up. It's easy to wash off. You can see here where there's a little bit of green paint and a dent here because I used this earlier for a different demonstration. And the nice thing is I can then let any colors I mix on here dry, and since it's watercolor, if I need them the next day, just reactivate it with water. So one way, of course, to make a darker value is to add the standard old black. Something we've been learning since elementary school. Now do remember that when you add black, you want to try to add small amounts at a time because black overtakes things quickly. So even that little tiny bit that was on the end of my brush, look how much darker my red became. And if I swatch it, we can already see it's a darker value of red. Even though the wash is thinner than this first one, I've still made a darker value of paint. So black, so if I start out with my red and I add black, I can get dark reds like this. Let's put another test swatch of red down. And I'm going to once again put some red paint on my plate for mixing. And one little hint also, I have this arranged like this so you can see everything on camera. One thing you should never do though is cross over top of your painting with a loaded paintbrush. You do usually want to keep your palette and your paints close to each other so that your work is off to the side and you're intentionally bringing the paint to the work and not passing paint over top of it just for mixing. So my next method to maybe make my colors darker is to use a different neutral. So instead of black, I could add some brown. It won't make it as dark as black, but it will definitely dull down the color. So I'm going to add a little bit more there. So anytime I go to mix in a new color, remember you want to wash your paintbrush. You want to try to preserve your colors as much as possible so you don't have to waste a lot of watercolor paint trying to clean off other colors over top of them. And this is what my color looks with brown mixed into it. So definitely darker than the original red out of the set. So this is again red, and then we've added brown. But there is a third way in which you can darken colors. Actually, there's a fourth way. But that kind of gets into more color mixing and the color wheel, like Analogous Colors. So we'll talk about both. So I can sometimes use Analogous Colors to darken in appearance compared to the original color. So if I again swatch my red onto my paper, and I'm going to once again bring over some red onto my plate. If I look at my color wheel, let me pull mine out here. It's underneath a couple of things. So if I pull out my color wheel, sometimes analogous colors can help darken a color. So even looking at my example here with colored pencil, if I add blue to make blue-green, of course blue-green is a bit of a darker value, not just a different color, but it's a bit of a darker value than regular green. Blue-purple, the same, sometimes red-purple. So you could try analogous colors at times, but if we want to darken it so that it's not quite as bright. So notice that these two mixtures both not only darken the red, but it also toned down the brightness of the red some. There's another way that we can do that. And I'm going to first add another layer of my black over top here since this one's started to dry. So you can see that we can layer to help darken values even more. But my third best way to darken values is complementary colors. So again, looking at the color wheel, complementary colors are colors opposite each other on the color wheel. And you know this already from your vocabulary test and from making your color wheel. So if I mix a little bit of green into my red, it's going to change the brightness of the red, make it a bit less bright, a bit less intense of a color, which will also then read as a darker value. So I'm going to pick up some green onto my paintbrush, and I'm going to mix it into my swatch of red here. And I'm going to test it out. So it's almost a color similar to when we mixed black into it. Has a little bit less of a purple tone to it than this one does. So that's three ways, three of the best ways I would say to create different values, especially for the darker values. So this is red plus the complementary color, which is green. So the reason why I wanted to go over this with you is, as I said earlier, your next stage of the project, this assignment, is that you are going to create a supply of paper to use on your final. And we're going to use value as one, so we want some light values, we want some medium values, and we want some dark values in this supply of paper. This is going to help with what we call atmospheric perspective. So perspective is the art of making a three-dimensional looking plane on a two-dimensional surface. It's about creating depth in our artwork. So keep in mind, as we go through the next stage, the next video of this assignment, that we are going to need our knowledge of creating values for this supply of textured watercolor paper. We are going to use our previous knowledge from step 2 of creating textured with watercolor techniques. So those are things like possibly sprinkling salt on it, scratching the surface lightly with a tool, dabbing a paper towel over top of it, letting plastic wrap rest over top of it. That texture sheet that we did early on, that is what we're going to combine now with value to create a supply of paper for our final project.